great, fantastic things, and maybe some of these titles will be familiar to you. The Return of the War Room, that was a film that Aaron edited for the Sundance Channel, and I was with the documentary masters, Chris Hedges and D.A. Pennebaker. 4 seasons lodge, aired on public television. When was that?
No, it was a one-off. We cut it in 2007, but I don't think it aired till 2010.
The Blood of My Brother, and just this past spring, Hell on Earth, the Fall of Syria and the Rising of ISIS, which was, did it have its premiere, Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, it was a Nat Geo commission, so it aired on Nat Geo in June. But.
So I did a tour through the film circuits. So Aaron is you'll come to discover pretty quickly, if you don't realize it already, that the editors are often the smartest people in the room. They bring order to chaos. They are just crucial in determining how best to tell a story, not just visually, but in terms of the character selection and scene selection, and really how to pace it out. So editors obviously have great skill and great expertise when it comes to visuals, but they also are just master storytellers in all, in the mechanics of telling a story. So Aaron's going to talk to you first about the more practical aspects of editing large projects, and these principles apply to small projects as well. So bringing in your media, organizing your media, processing it, preparing it to actually work with. And then he'll spend time to talk about the aesthetics of editing. All throughout his talk, feel free to pipe up with any and all questions. He's open to answering technical questions or artistic questions that really tap into his brain. It's a good one, and and it's a real pleasure to have him here today. So, without further ado,
Thanks, Betsy.
pass you the baton.
So I'll just second what she said. I have no idea what you guys have been learning, so feel free to jump in with questions at any point. However I can be helpful to you, I want to know that. So I'm going to start by going through, this is a project I'm in the middle of now. I've been working on it for about 3 months, and I want to show you guys how the content is organized in here. But again, jump in as you guys have questions. So I'm going to start from the beginning and work my way up to the point where I really engage. There's a whole bunch of work that the producer and the assistant editor will do to organize content before I ever look at it. And so here we're looking at the original camera media, right? And they're bringing it in. Let's take a look at the interviews. They're organizing it by, it's a filmmaking couple in San Francisco. They're doing filming for this project in New York. So they've made a trip every few months. And every time they go, we get a folder. And in this case, you're seeing in January they did 4 interviews.
Wait, Aaron, I'm sorry. I interrupt a lot, sorry.
Please.
So are you here editing away, and they're shooting, and they're giving you footage from the field, so you're taking it in and organizing it? Is that kind of, I'm just wondering what the workflow is.
Great. So the project we're in right now is what we call the Edit Project, and there are 2 projects that actually exist that I never touch. The first one is the Master Assets Project, and that's where they're bringing in all of the raw media and just doing absolutely no organization outside of shoot date. So it's just the place you can always go back to reference your original content. That is then being pulled in from there into the Edit Prep Project, I think they call it. And the assistant editor is going through and is doing a lot of the organization work that then I pull into my project.
And then what is your relationship? What's the relationship between you and the assistant editor?
The assistant editor is taking half of his direction from me and half of his direction from the producer. So there's a lot of stuff is coming in. I have no idea what's come in. He'll work with them to make sure that he gets everything, that it gets processed appropriately. But then, and we'll get to this in a little bit, once I start engaging with material, I'll have needs and requests. about how to organize stuff differently than has already been done. There may be different ways I want to look at it, and so I'll ask him, hey, can you put together this this group of clips on this topic, or this group of characters, or this period of time. So where we're starting here is just organizing what was shot, right? We've got this Brian Patterson interview, we've got a whole bunch of interviews, and at the most basic level, you can just go and find your media there. I almost never go there, because what they're creating for me next are sequences of each of those interviews. And this I'll reference a lot, so they're taking, for each of these, let's take a look at a sequence here. This is an interview from August of 2016, and it's got all of the clips that were in that interview, because that interview had 40 clips or something. And in addition to laying it all out so it's all in one sequence, they've also done a ton of organizational work here to make my life easier. So I want to call out a few things in here. First, you see pretty much every clip starts with a marker. If I hover over it, if it's nice to me, you'll see what's in the marker. There you go. And so what they've done is actually they've transcribed the whole interview, and then they've brought that into the markers on the timeline. Well, first the markers in the clips, and then the clips are on the timeline. And what is so amazing about this is I can actually search within this timeline for any word. And it will search inside the markers, and I can find that. So if I'm looking for, this interview is with a guy named Ray. If I'm looking for any time he talks about his brother Barry, I just search on Barry, and it'll pop that up, and I can click through them, and I can watch each of those. Absolutely. So I just hit Apple F. I don't want to search all, I just want to search markers. And it seems like the last time I was searching on something religious. I'll search on Barry. And there we go. And let's see in here. These are long sections, but I'm guessing somewhere in here. And the other thing you can do is go into your markers tab if you're in that clip. And you can also see the transcript in the markers in here. There are limitations to this. I hate the fact that it will only show me 3 lines no matter how much text you have in that marker. But if you've got the transcript handy and you know what you're looking for, which I almost always do, this just gets me to the starting point, and I use that and I either watch through that clip, or I know from the transcript I need to go down a little bit, and I'll punch in. So transcription's in there. The other thing that they're doing in here, which is I don't use directly for the most part, but helps them continuing to build out stuff that is helpful to me, is these colored clips that are called transparent video clips, and they don't show up as anything on the screen, right? You don't see the red bingo hall, but it's just a way to visually indicate on the timeline something. And so what the assistant editor is doing is he's created all of these themes at the direction of the producer before I even came on board. And he's indicating which sections of this interview are relevant to all of these different themes. And so some sections of the interview will only have 1, some will have 3, and it's his first pass at indicating what is being talked about throughout the interview.
So those aren't actual clips, they're just like little labels?
Exactly. It's I'm used to having 2 big screens, so apologize for my slowness here. If you go down to create transparent video, that will create something, and then you can name it, and you'll end up with these things in here. And he's given each one a different color, so it's nice and easy to find. And of course, you can also search on those. So if you're looking for what we see before, the red bingo hall, I can't search on markers now because it's not that. If I search on everything and I go for red bingo, it'll take me to the next red bingo. So that's also an easy way to look through. Yeah.
So are those like B-roll scenes that they've already gathered, or are those like larger themes just so that you know what is being talked about?
These are large themes in the film. So this, just so you have some additional context, this film is about a Native American tribe in upstate New York called the Oneidas. They started having bingo in the late 70s. That was before casino gaming was legal on Native American reservation land. They now have $1 billion a year, give or take, casino and resort business. So the Red Bingo Hall, there were 3 bingo halls before the casino. The red bingo hall is the second, and that's a period of time between 1985 and 1987, and that's the way that he'll indicate that they're loosely discussing that period of time. Yeah.
So nothing's been cut at this point. The transparent video is like one whole half clip with those color markers. Are they just the section that's talking about that theme?
Yes.
And then so that discrimination, that's another section marker that's covered across all of those.
Mhm. The one thing that they did that I actually would not do is like they cut out the questions or dead air in here, and that's these blank spots. I don't find that helpful. I do like that I would just cut the clip, add a new question, so you can see like, oh, that's the next question, that's the next part, and put the markers in there. But if you extended this here and you extended this here, you'd have the whole uncut interview. Yeah.
Why put the marker in a clip rather than the sequence?
Because that is then going to move with the clip everywhere the clip goes. If you put it in the sequence and then you cut that clip into your edit, see here for something I'm working on that's pulling from 30 different interviews, I can go into any of these interview things, and I'm just going to match frame in, and you see the markers here. That's got my transcript. So that's going to move with it throughout the whole project. There are times where it might be useful to put markers on the sequence. There's just a lot of soul searching, for lack of a better word, and thinking about how you want to go through your project and what you're going to need down the line. Yeah.
Wasn't that really long on top?
Oh, let's take a look here. I have no idea. It's a good question. I don't know why he put that up there. Okay. So step one, we've got a whole interview. We've got themes from that interview. And what he is then doing, which is interesting, but I will tell you not something that I actually use, but an interesting way to think about it is we're going to take this guy, the same guy, Ray, and what he has done is he's created what they call a character assembly. I would call it a string out because there's really no thought that's gone into it yet particularly. But he's merged the themes. So let's find our red bingo again. There we go. He has brought in all of the, let me show you the timeline, the program viewer. He's brought in all of the different moments throughout the interview, and as it turns out, 2 interviews with this guy, where he's referring to the red bingo hall. And so begun to organize from the interview. And the other thing that he'll do in here, which is can be kind of cool, is he'll bring in archival material that's relevant to that. So if he's talking about the red bingo and we have scenes that are exactly the moment he's talking about, or newspaper articles that refer to the event he's talking about, he'll pull that in here as well. And again, we're just kind of stepping one foot deeper into the pool in terms of organizing this in a way that you could jump in, engage, and start editing. Okay? The stage where I engage a little more is what we are calling theme assemblies. And so let's see if we can find the red bingo. There we go, since we're sticking with that. And what he's done here is pulled in for the red bingo. We've got 45 minutes of content from every interviewee who talks about this particular period of time. And also the newspaper articles that are relevant to that. And so this is the spot where I start working with it, because this is a scene in the film. Maybe it's 2 scenes, maybe it's 3 scenes, but it's a very clearly delineated moment in time that we know will be some portion of the film. And so what I have him do is take this and build a transcript out of it. Some people like to watch, some people like to read. I'm a reader, I swear by transcripts. If a project told me they did not have transcripts, I would not take the project. But so I've got this sequence, and I've got a transcript that's got exactly that. I actually have the red bingo ball here. Exactly that. And so when I start editing, I will go through the transcript, and that will be my first indication into what story these characters tell. And not everything comes through in the transcript. Some interviewees have more emotion, more pauses. Sometimes what can be 3 words on paper will be 20 seconds of gold on video, but for the most part, you can get a pretty good sense of the arc that is in the content that you have. And so, you were asking before in terms of working with the assistant editor. These kinds of theme assemblies, the Red Bingo is an obvious one. It's a period of time. It covers 2 years, but there are a lot that at the beginning of the project, we don't know what they're going to be. So are we going to do a whole scene about religion or about this particular tribe's treaties with the US pre-1800? And so as I'm going, I'll say to him, hey, I'm seeing something emerge here. Can we put together a theme sequence about this? And some scenes will end up coming from multiple different themes. It'll end up being that religion is introduced at the same time as the treaties in the 1800s, and those come together, and so I'm pulling from multiple places, and then vice versa. The Red Bingo Hall is actually a massive thing, and it ends up covering a big part of the film, and so that may end up being 3 or 4 scenes. And so in some cases, I may say, can you go into that and actually pull out the opening of the Bingo Hall in 1985 and make that its own thing, everybody just talking about that, and then can you go in and talk about the operation of the Bingo Hall between 85 and 87, and then can you make a separate sequence about when the army faction of the tribe came in and took over the Bingo Hall and burned it down. True story.
One more question. When you're saying scenes, how are you defining scene? What's just kind of the definition of scene, and what collection of material when do you know you have enough material to have what you consider fully made scene?
I have no good answer to that question
Yeah.
because, the best, I'll answer it by example. So I just told you that the Bingo Hall was taken over and burned down. There's a 2-month period in between when these guys come in and take it over and when it's burnt down. And there's a woman who lives across the street from the Bingo Hall who filmed the whole thing on her Handycam. This is in the 90s. And so we have 10 hours of video from her. We have 10 hours of phone calls to the local authorities that she recorded. We've got all of these people's interviews. We've got news from the time. We've got newspapers. And so on the one hand, this could be a 3 or 4 minute, very compact scene it's very rich, or it could be 6 scenes. And we don't really know that until much deeper in the film. And so at an early stage, which is where we're at now, I'll really just honor what the material has. And so if there's enough material to take that 2-month period and build out 10 different scenes, each 3 minutes long, where you really live with it and it's emotional and it starts and it ends, then I'll do that. And we'll string that out, and that's where we'll start. And if the people talk about it as in, well, first they took it over and then they burned it, and there's really nothing in between, then you'll end up with a shorter moment. And so there's just a lot of kind of exploration and discovery that comes in interacting with the footage itself. Yeah?
Are you limited by the number of themes, by the number of colors?
No. I don't pay too much attention to the colors. I think it probably helps Tommaso, the assistant. But you can repeat. Somewhere in here, I'll show you what he's done. Is he's just some titles. Yeah. So this is our theme list. You can see the colors on the left, and they repeat. Premiere's got like 9 colors or something, and we've got a shit ton of themes, right? So, it's not. We're not using a built-in Premiere feature here. We're just utilizing Premiere's thing for our own organizational end. Transcripts. I want to show you.
Somebody doing that by hand, or are you using service for transcripts?
They're sending them out. There you go. Okay, so transcripts can look a few different ways. You saw them baked into the timeline and markers and the clips. This is from a previous project from Hell on Earth. And one of the cool things about this is in Google Sheets. And one of the things I like about it, if it will scroll, it does not seem to want to. Come on. There we go. So what you see here is that those same kinds of themes that we had in the timeline in those transparent videos is here in the transcript. And so, with Google, what's really great is you have all these in a folder, and you've been marking corruption as one of your themes. You can just search corruption in Google, and it will give you every transcript in that folder that has corruption in there somewhere. Now, that could be in the body of the transcript, or it could be a theme. This has its own drawbacks too. It's very difficult to do anything inside a cell in Google Sheets. So, if you've got transcribers doing this and they put a lot in one cell, you can't bold in there, you can't highlight, you're kind of limited to that cell. But, this is cool for its searchability. Personally, I'm a paper guy, so I end up printing them out and writing in the margins. Which helps me in terms of embedding it in my memory, but these notes that I have now are not searchable, and that kind of sucks. At some point, I am ambitious to figure out how to do that on an iPad where I can take notes and it would then be searchable, but I have not gotten there yet. And then the other thing I want to show you in here is this is the equivalent of our theme sequences. This is also from the Syria project. You can see on the bottom there was a tab for each of these different themes, and then they would pull in the rows that were relevant to this particular theme. And so I would print this out and start from this. And so if I was cutting a scene about corruption or the origin of ISIS, I would start from there, and that would have all of the interview content relevant to that particular theme that we captured. Okay. One other thing I want to show you guys is archival. In both of these, yeah, you have a question?
Will you have sound bites replicated to different themes?
Absolutely. An incredible amount of redundancy. So we'll talk about this in a bit too, but there's this challenge of you don't want a theme to be too narrow, because then you're not getting the sense of like what that person was talking about around it. So for instance, if you think about this 2-month period in the Red Bingo Hall, and you make one that's just one particular day, you may lose the sense of the story that.
When you're getting all of this material, are you processing it on a kind of scale where it's like you get a couple of selected views at a time, or you're going through all of this at one moment and you're kind of like picking out how to make it more bite-sized?
So with this project, we spent probably 2 weeks watching footage. Did not watch all of the footage, anywhere near all the footage. It's an interview-based film. I think if it's more of a picture-based film, a verite-based film, you might watch everything. But in this case, we just watched to kind of start the conversation and to talk together. And then after that, I dove straight into these theme sequences. And so with the idea being that we had talked loosely about the structure of the film, which in this case is a historical fact. Right? We knew a lot of these things had happened over the course of the tribe's last 40 years. And so we started in places where, because they were relevant topics in the news, there's just an immense amount of archival material, and organizing that is incredibly important, both so you can find it and so you can ultimately figure out where you found it in the first place so you can go and license it. In this case, for this film, that is mostly stills, or for our purposes, we're going to look at the stills. And you can see here they've broken down the stills by kind of type of image. That may not be useful in every film. That may not be the way you want to break it down. Maybe you want to break it down by character. Maybe you want to break it down by time, decade, etc. That's how they chose to do it. And you can see within each of these they went further. So within photos, we've got photos of different things. And you can pop in here and you can see what we've got there. But this always references back to, so this is our stills archive sheet, also a Google sheet. And basically in at 25 frames per second because we had a lot of ISIS propaganda material that we were pulling from the web. And that was all shot in 25. And one little bit Premiere would handle fine. But when I started to try and export the finished 100-minute film, I could not do it from Premiere in one go. I would have to actually export 7 sections and then bring that back into Premiere and re-export. So it really depends on the nature of your material and the nature of the project. Short project, probably you're not going to have any issues. A longer project, it may be worth transcoding. And then there are separate questions about whether you're transcoding just for the edit and you're going to go back to the original at the end, or whether you're going to create a transcoded version right at the start that is of quality so that you can edit with it and then use it in your final project.
Is that your decision to make, or is that the producers? Like if you were to do it again, would you transfer for a long?
I would have, yeah. It drove me absolutely nuts. I mean, not being able to, there was a month period where all we were doing was watching full outputs of the film, right? I was outputting the whole film every 3 days. And so to have to do 2 runs of it, and sometimes when you export 7 bits, it would fuck up in the middle of that somewhere. And so I have to, I'm locked to the computer to make sure I'm in the house. I don't have to be working, but I have to pop back every 10 minutes to make sure it hasn't crashed. And when you're trying to upload it to Sundance in 4 hours so they can look at your cut, that makes it that much more stressful. So yes, I would have transcoded or created proxies or something. So to step back a bit, I just want to say a few things about the why behind all of the organization. There are infinite ways to organize both technically and thematically. And every single project is totally different. I don't have a set way that I've done it on the films that I've worked on. It really is a question of what kind of material do we have, what kind of story are we telling. And so I'm just going to rattle off a handful of different ways to think about, right? You've got bins and clips, that's where we started, and depending on the nature of your content, that's how you may be organized. You may not need sequences. You've got short clips, and you're throwing them in bins, and the bins is named something, and that's how you find stuff. Subclips, I imagine you guys have talked about that a little bit. So, if you've got really long sequences, that's super helpful, and so that also enables you to throw stuff all over. You can subclip throughout your whole thing, and you've got different bins, you've got the same clip subclipped in 12 different ways, and you can find stuff that way. Sequences, which we've looked at here, are really useful. You can get a little lost in a sequence, and so, it's a question of when do you want to move to that point. It's always a little bit harder to find something in the sequence, which is why we have this kind of colored overlays in here. The empty transparent clips that we looked at are really useful. Markers are fantastic. We looked at them for the purpose of transcription, but you can really use them for anything. And one trick, which maybe you guys have looked at, or maybe not, is you can give your markers different colors, and then you can, we don't really have them here, but you can filter the markers window by the marker color. And so if you're using a particular, let's say lilac is your B-roll, right? And you just put a lilac marker every time you've got a B-roll shot in an interview. You've got the subject's hands, or you've got the, the pot of coffee brewing behind them, and then you just click on that, and it'll filter to that, and you'll only see your B-roll from that clip or from that sequence, which can be really useful. We haven't looked at metadata, and we're not using it too much in this project, but that's another great way to organize stuff and can be your primary. It's so easy to search in there. So I sometimes use, this doesn't have I sometimes use description. You'll see it in my sequences. I'll put in description like what I've done to each sequence or if we reviewed it. But with original clips, you can put in whatever whatever data you want in there, and then that'll pull up in your search, and that's another easy way to do it. The last one I want to mention is search bins. Have you guys been familiarized with search bins? So basically, you can search in here for, we were looking at Ray's interview, so you can search for Ray, and it'll theoretically, there you go, find every time Ray comes up. Or if, sorry, I'll just talk through it. Is it still working? No. Or you can create a search bin, which is that little icon right next to the search field. There was a little folder with a search eyeglass in it. And if you click on that, you can actually create a bin that will always have that search results. So for instance, if in your metadata you put B-roll and then you create a B-roll search bin, all of your B-roll will show up in that search bin and will be pulled from wherever it is in the project. Which is really useful because it's updating over time and you don't have to think about constantly going back to that. That can kind of be one of your organizational structures. Any questions while this reopens? Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question just about sharing the information back and forth, because you're working with producers who may not be on site, right? So are you sharing the full Premiere project with them every time, or are you sending like session files back and forth?
So in terms of our content review, we're doing that at the office in SF together. But we have 3 projects, and how those projects communicate with each other can be pretty tricky. And so right at the beginning, I was talking about the master assets project and the edit prep project, and the assistant editor is continuing to update the edit prep project over time. So as they film new interviews, he's going to make new select sequences, and he's going to clean up his markers because he's finding errors and he wants to keep all the data nice and clean, and so he's going to go through over time and make that better. And so the way that we deal with that is, you see this folder, 00 Aaron content. That's the only folder that I ever change. All of the other ones are the folders he creates in his project. And so what I actually do is, whenever he's done a new pass on his project and he's updated it, I will go and open a duplicate of his project, and I will pull my folder into it. And the direction which you go is important in that, because if I pulled his content into my project, then a lot of the clips already in my project would have the old markers. So this is kind of inane Premiere stuff that drives me bananas all day long. But that's how we figured out to make it work.
What's in your folder?
So mostly my edits. There's a few other stuff, like I'm pulling random stuff from the web. So I've got an internet downloads folder. Music is all mine. I'm occasionally making select sequences. Art is random color mats and nested sequence graphics that I'm putting together. But for the most part, it's really just my edits.
So then how does that information go? Do you then share that? Like, as you're doing rounds of edits, how do you get that information integrated back into like the larger Premiere project?
I don't. This is where that lives.
Okay.
Because no one else is working with the edits. That's just me. If we had 2 editors, then there would be a question of like, okay, how do we share our sequences back and forth? We're not really doing that. It's really a one-way passage of organized information from them to me, and then I'm putting the edits together. That said, we could pass my sequences back in the way that I described without causing any issues. The biggest thing to watch out for there is versioning and making sure you have some kind of nomenclature so that you know that the version that I'm working on in my project is different than the version you're working on in your project. One thing that I always do on mine, you'll see on these, is I always have the date and my initials. And it's just an easy way to make sure that if somebody else is working on it, they'll see that. It's like pretty obvious, and hopefully update it and change the initials, and that way you can tell who was in it. In this project, that's not as much of an issue. Yeah.
As far as your organization stuff, does it change from project to project or team to team? Or do you kind of like come up with your way of working with material and then stick to it?
So a lot of this organizational scheme was built before I started the project. The reason I'm not going through the Surya film with you guys is because that also was built before I started the project, and it's a total shit show. We had probably 50 Premiere projects. I mean, also when I started, there were 4 editors. It was just it was disorganized in every way you could possibly imagine. And so in that project, I just figured out how to deal. It was about coping more than about anything else. This one, they did a really good job. And when I came on, we've tinkered with some stuff. And so like I pointed out, the character assemblies aren't that useful to me. The assistant's spending less time on them for new stuff that's coming in or skipping them altogether. But the place for me where it all starts is with the transcripts. And so I always want those theme transcripts. And having an assistant who can do that is invaluable to me because it means I'm starting from a place of some kind of narrowness as opposed to having to go through and really organize all of that content and break it down myself. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about roles and project phases. So the project I'm working on now has 2 directors, an assistant, and me, and that's pretty much it. The Surya project had 2 directors, had a managing producer, had, when I started, 4 editors. By the end, it was me and an assistant. We had 2 PAs, an archivist, multiple translators. And so, I mean, that was like a massive team. And what I found on Docs is every single team, like there's absolutely no standard expectation of what a title person is going to do on any particular project, especially the ones you would most expect to be predictable. Directors sometimes do absolutely nothing, and sometimes want to sit next to you and tell you everything to do, and treat you more like a operator of the machine, right? And it's been totally. I've been on both sides of that spectrum, and to a certain extent, the only predictable thing for me is that I need to be able to do it all. And be flexible enough to work with what other people are bringing to the table. So sometimes directors want to see a rough cut and nothing before that. Sometimes they want to see every scene as you cut it. They want to know what you're going through. They want to talk about it with you. And it really runs the gamut. And sometimes, honestly, like they don't want to even really, they don't care. Like they want the thing to be good and done, and that's it. The one other role that's really interesting is the role of writer. You'll see it on a lot of docs more and more these days. Sometimes there is a writer who is not credited as anything else. Often you'll see one or multiple of the directors credited as a writer, and often you'll see the editor credited as a writer. And there's also not a ton of predictability around what people mean by writing. But I think that conversation is developing. And I mean, from my perspective, writing is about, it's sometimes very hands-on, dealing with transcripts and looking at a script of the film. And other times it's really stepping back, 30,000-foot view, note cards on the wall, figuring out how we can tell this story effectively. And often you would expect that role to be the director. Often it's not. And the editor.
Why is that? I'm sure the answer is very, but generally speaking, because I think the assumption is the director comes in, here's my material, here's my vision, they can articulate it, they have a good sense of how they want to tell the story. So what accounts for a director is kind of like,
I mean, any number of things. I've worked with newspaper journalists who found a good story. They knew it was a good story. They'd never made a film before. And honestly, they still had a full-time job. And so they had some sense of the vibe of the story they wanted to tell and not much past that. Sometimes it's skill set. Sometimes it's availability. Often it's skill set. Often the skills you need to go out and work with people and get this thing off the ground and raise money are very different than the ones you need to obsessively look at the same material over and over again for months on end and figure out how this can be effective to an audience. And often the directors are far too attached to some idea. In the Syria film, there were a number of really fascinating dead ends that the director-producer had wandered down and that he felt were really powerful. That just didn't make any sense. And you have to kind of work that out of them over time. And usually you win, and sometimes you don't. Yeah, so writing is an unusual one. In Hell on Earth, we had a writer. He's actually a former editor, and he was fascinating to work with him. Would actually go through the transcripts and write the thing on paper and send it to me. And essentially would save me a day on each thing that I was working on. Because I would start from that, and they were a guess. He didn't watch the footage at all. But basically, he would say, I think this idea and this arc is going to get us where we need to go. Now go make it functional. And so I would go in and I would say, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Or like, that's pretty good, but we need to end it. And so I would work on that and turn it around and send it back to him. And in this case, the directors were more absentee, so I would work with him and I would say for many of those near-term turnarounds, he was playing more of a director role. And we were doing that work together until we felt good, and we would send it off to the directors for more of a higher level feedback session. The other thing I want to talk about before we watch some clips is phases of the project. So I think about it in kind of four that I've broken down into watching, assembling, roughing, and fining, or watch, assemble, rough, and fine. And that first watching is really where you're just learning. And like I was saying before, on a verite project or a more poetic project, you might need to do a whole lot of watching before you start doing anything else. On a project that's more interview-based, you're watching to get a sense of the characters, but maybe the transcripts bring out as much as anything else. And so maybe you're doing less of that before you're moving on to the next stage. But it's really like onboarding to a new job. You start from scratch, you know nothing, and you need to understand this world, what the parameters are. You need to poke around in the B-roll and see what did they capture, how are they thinking about it? What are their strengths as cinematographers, right? Are they getting lots of establishing shots, lots of shots in nature? How should I be thinking about this project based on what they're capturing? Assembling is when you're starting to go through and really think about scenes, and it's kind of like figuring out what's possible. And so sometimes we'll end up with an 8-hour assembly, which is just everything as you're going through, you're cutting, you're making something that feels meaningful, and you get to a point where you can just look at all this stuff together. There's not a ton of thought about how it fits together yet. Just an idea that all of these things either felt meaningful coming from the footage itself, or you needed to cover it because of the story you're telling. So sometimes in the assembly, you'll also find big holes, right? That you go through and you're like, oh, we actually did not ask anybody about the 1984 to 1985 period, and we've got a big gap there, and we can't get from where we are here to where we are here. Either we need to use text, or we need to go back and do more interviews to fill that gap. And so then you move from an assembly to a rough, and at that point you're really starting to think about structure. And so, whereas the assembly often will be chronological and you'll just kind of do your best to put it in an order that loosely makes sense, when you start to get to the rough cut, you'll start thinking about, well, where do we really want our backstory to go? Often you're not starting the film at the beginning, and so you're starting at some dramatic point towards the beginning, but maybe a little bit down the road. And as the film progresses, you're filling in gaps. You're filling in people's origin stories. You're filling in groups of characters' origin stories. And it's at that point that you really start to work with that and figure out how you can structure this. And a lot of that can happen in note cards. You'll see pictures of people with hundreds of note cards up on the wall. And it's a great way to think about the structure of the film because it's just so easy to move this stuff around as you're playing with it, and you can just screenshot it, and then you've got multiple versions as you think through it. And in making those kinds of note cards, often you'll have something as big as a scene. This scene's pretty much working. It's a 5-minute scene. It's one note card. And other times you'll have just taglines where you've got a 12-second line that you want to use that's really powerful, but you don't know where it fits yet because it kind of applies to a lot, and you may want to move that around because you know it's hinging the film in one way or another. And then when you move from rough to fine, you're really looking at, okay, we kind of feel like this structure moving through the story in this way is working. You're looking more at pacing. A lot of your scenes are going to get shorter. Just trying to make the film work at this point, really move it through and keep the audience's attention. You're starting to do graphics and music, and bring it into a place that starts to look like what you'd expect from a finished film. One other thing along the way that's worth mentioning, I wouldn't call it a stage, but for individual scenes, I'll often do a radio edit, which is, especially with interview films, is pictureless. I mean, maybe the picture's on there, but basically what I'm doing is before I've even thought at all about what you're going to be seeing, I'm just writing the story in these interview bites. And often it will be very, very choppy because I'm taking one person's interview and I'm cutting it all up. And I'm not thinking about pacing, I'm not thinking about picture, I'm just trying to figure out, do these people tell the story I want them to tell? And what story is that? And moving it around and reorganizing. It's a useful way to kind of gut check, yeah, like I'm hitting the points I need to hit before I start bringing it to life more. Yeah.
How much is an 8-hour assembly a radio edit versus like actually have B-roll?
How much?
Yeah.
What
Like,
do you-
is your 8-hour assembly a radio edit? Or?
No, the radio edit is something I would probably do on the way to making a scene for the assembly. So in my first, so I mentioned before, like when the bingo hall is taken over, we have 10 hours of footage from across the street, right? That can be used in a number of different ways. Before I even get to that footage, I'm taking the interview, I'm looking at the story that they're telling, and I'm just building out what is the interview that gets us through this scene. And that's my radio edit, and I'll watch that a bunch of times to make sure that I'm telling the whole arc. And then I'll go into the archival material, and I'll look at that and I'll say, where does this fit? And it will change the radio edit. I'm not committed to the radio edit at that point. It's just my first idea of things, and then the archival will slot in and it'll start to feel more like a scene. But I would do that before I get to the assembly. It's just a stage of building a scene, kind of an iterative moment along the way. Yeah.
We have a pretty heavy interview-driven piece.
Mhm.
What kind of creative ways do you find to get, especially if you're doing something sensitive material or hard to get live footage of, what creative ways do you get different visuals and visuals?
Every project has its own answer to that. This film, we have a lot of stills of the characters because, they're just people and they've got pictures from their lives. And so we can use that to bring things to life in different ways. And the ways in which you treat the visuals that you have make a pretty big difference. Have any of you seen Strong Island? I've only seen the first half so far, but it's a really fascinating, moving doc, and it's a personal doc. The director's in it, and she has all these family photos, and she's actually filmed herself moving the photos onto a white background. You see her hands in it, they move around, and sometimes when she wants a close-up, you'll actually see her filming through a magnifying glass. And one of the, from an editing perspective, I'm watching that and thinking, wow, you can leave this on screen so much longer because it's so much more dynamic. And you've got a little picture, a tall picture, and you don't want to blow it up to fill the screen. And this makes it feel like you're interacting with it in a different way, and you feel the emotion of the director's hands being on them. And so it just totally changes the way in which you're able to get through that moment. And so that's a creative example I've seen recently. There are other, I worked for a year filming oral histories of Rwandan genocide survivors in Kigali, and I made an hour-long piece from three survivors' interviews. And so I'm cutting up their interviews, obviously I can't not cut, but I have no B-roll, zero. And so that was its own challenge, and what I would do is go through and really think about every time I was going to cut away, as do I need to cut away here or not? And what I ended up doing was having, I forget what the number of frames was, but I would have a certain number of frames of black. And that's the whole piece is like that. It would just be cut from the same person, you get 14 frames of black or whatever it was. And it just meant that I couldn't do it that often because if I'm constantly cutting to black, it's too distracting, right? But it was a way to honor the sensitivity of that material because it didn't feel like putting stuff over it just to cover my edit would be more meaningful than looking at it.
Here we have about 20 minutes. Maybe you guys can sit around for a while. Let's maybe pivot to some of your speakers.
Is this going to give me sound? Sound will come through here. Let's see. Let's do test. Can you hear that? Okay. All right, so what I'm going to show you, have any of you guys seen Hell on Earth? Okay, so we got a couple. I'm going to show you 3 versions of the opening scene. They're all totally different, and yet not that different at the same time. We'll start from, we're going to go in chronological order of the edit. So the last one we'll see is the one that's actually in the film. And what I want you guys to be thinking about as we watch is, well, especially those of you who haven't seen the film, which is most of you, what film is this starting? And how are these 3 intros potentially feel like they're starting different films? Each is just about 2 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes to talk.
Wanted a war. This sounds strange. Why on earth would any regime or government or state provoke a war against itself? They thought that in a war they could win. Vacuum, these mad Islamists came in and exploited it, which has created absolute hell on earth.
Okay, so that's version 1. Here's version 2.
The rationale of terrorism depends on grievance. Grievance is what motivates individual people to sacrifice their life. That sense of failed justice and wrongdoing. I remember seeing a clip of a Syrian rebel fighter, big beard, AK-47, extremely aggressive, intimidating, angry-looking guy. He's railing against America.
وسوف نغزوكم كما كنتم تغزوننا وسوف نسبي نساءكم كما سبيتم نساءنا وسوف نيتم أطفالكم كما يتمتم أطفالنا.
We're going to turn your children into orphans, like you turned our children into orphans.
والله يا أخوان نحن اليوم في فرحة والله يشهد الله عز وجل لن نستطيع نصيبها.
When you're fighting people like the man in that video who really don't care whether they live or die, the thing that they want to do is to hurt us back. When you reduce someone like that to tears, you have created a generational problem, and we're seeing that now in Syria.
And here's the one that ended up in the film.
When a society collapses into anarchy and violence, civilians inevitably take matters into their own hands. They form armed militias. They put up checkpoints and roadblocks. They kill or expel anyone in the area who might threaten their grip on power. In that kind of environment, radical ideologies are almost guaranteed to take hold. Radicalism depends on desperation. It depends on grievance. And it then provides its own harsh answers to the corruption and the violence that afflict much of the world. People will always turn to radicalism once they have exhausted every other option. They have to. Their very survival is at stake.
Yay for graphics. All right, so those are three. I'm curious to hear from somebody, from one of you, what you thought about the differences between the three and how you thought, what different film you thought they might start.
The first one was really prominent. It gave me goosebumps and it made me very uncomfortable to watch. The second one I felt like was more emotional, and then the third one seemed more kind of informational. It was the least upsetting of the three.
Yeah, so some of the things we were thinking about, the first one was before we had, so the voice you hear in 2 and 3 is Sebastian's, and he's one of the directors, and we knew we had to introduce him because his voice was going to pop up a bunch. So that was a huge consideration, was just making sure that we set the tone for hearing his voice. But beyond that, I think they lead you in pretty different directions. The second one in particular, just by mentioning the West, we're going to do to your children what you did to our children, makes me think that this is a film about terrorism's coming to Europe and the States, which is not really what our film's about. And so it's powerful, it's emotional. As it turns out, it's also factually incorrect. That guy was Belgian, which we learned at some point after having cut that version of the intro. But it felt like it was taking us to a different film than the one we were making. 1 and 3 both do a pretty decent job of setting up Syria, but I think your point is right, that the first one is, you're really right in the middle of what is a very gory moment, whereas the third one, though you're still in a battle scene, is more detached. You know, like, you actually do see someone killed in that as well, but you're further back. And you're setting the tone that, like, we are taking a 30,000-foot view. We are not, I mean, we do go into that moment from number 1 is in the film, but that the film as a whole is going to look at this from a 30,000-foot perspective and not from an individual character's perspective. We've got 10 minutes left. I am happy to answer any questions you guys have. Yeah.
I'm curious, where you got the footage right in the beginning of the first clip where it's like quiet and the
So for the Syria film, I have no idea where we got that clip in particular, but I can tell you where we got, we have so much footage like that. There's a pretty decent network of Syrian activists and media folk who have collected footage of atrocities and war So we were able to go to them and say, we're looking for any footage that exists of the protest in March in Homs. We've read such and such about it, and they would be able to provide us with the cell phone videos that people shot that day, that they'd been collecting over time. That one in particular, I have no idea where that one came from, but we collected quite a bit of footage like that. Yeah.
I guess just coming on what Wendy just said, the fact that it was like audio recorded exploded, is that something you almost see that there's like pre-knowledge of something about happening and get the footage of that?
So that one I chose because it's, you don't know that's about to happen, right? It's shocking. And the intention was, well, let's see if this works, to literally jolt you out of your seat in the first moment of this film that is literally about hell on earth, right? But no, most of them are not quite like that, though you do see, the Syrian military drops barrel bombs, which are literally barrels packed with explosives that they push out of the back of a helicopter and fall wherever they fall in a city. And people on the ground are watching the helicopters, and then they see the thing fall out of the helicopter. And so we have footage of that where you can track the barrel coming down, and then you see the explosion. This was happening enough that, you could capture this stuff with some predictability. A shot that good, I would imagine there's some luck in there.
How do you check the veracity of the clip? So you're getting them obviously from an activist point of view, but from a Western point of view, you don't have the touch points like I can when I'm dealing with footage from the United States, I can probably say, well, that doesn't look like Montana. Those people were in that. So I'm interested in, you said that you also found out that somebody wasn't Belgian or something. So
Right.
How did you go about that?
So I, as the editor, I'm relying on other people for that because, I'm jumping from project to project every 6 or 12 months, so I'm never going to be the expert. But in this case, the producer was pretty knowledgeable. And in some cases, I would flag particular shots or questions for him and say, can you go to your contacts and confirm this seems suspicious for X, Y, or Z reason? And we would do that. Because it was commissioned by Nat Geo, they also had a fact checker that would go through everything. I do not think they fact checked the veracity of a shot being in a place, but certainly everyone's words. And there were certain things like in the film, John McCain says something about Saudi warplanes being on the runway when Obama decides not to bomb Syria after the chemical attacks in 2013, and that's not public information. And so we kind of went on the rounds about it, and then we went back to McCain's office, and he said, I had a conversation with the Saudis, and he said, okay, well, he's a sitting senator. If he tells us he had a conversation with the Saudis and that's not verifiable any other way, we trust that. We're okay with that. And it's his face on screen, so if it's him lying, that's just as much on him as it is on us. Yeah.
So we're looking at some ISIS propaganda videos. How does that work? Can you just kind of grab anyone on the internet and put it up, or is it
In terms of licensing?
Sure.
Our sense is that you do not need to worry about IP when taking from a terrorist organization.
I don't know, is there some sort of, I don't know the territory of it, is it
So
you're not allowed to take this video, the US government's that?
They're hard to find. At the beginning they were on YouTube and they were using Twitter and they got kicked off of Twitter and they got kicked off of YouTube. And so when I first started the project, we had 4 propaganda videos. And we had one interviewee who says, they make every kind of video. They even make cooking shows. And I'm like, what the hell? How can this guy be saying they make every kind of video? And we have 4. We ended up hiring an Egyptian American who started searching in Arabic. And that totally changed the world for us. And he found, we must have hundreds and hundreds of ISIS propaganda videos, including, I wouldn't quite call them cooking shows, but you see a lot of cooking, more than you would expect.
Being editor, what do you feel? I was a little bit, I love the transparency, but I was a little bit taken aback recently. Ken Burns, there was a breakdown of some scenes, documentary yourself, or do you feel the industry does? We have a fairly strong, well, I think we have a stronger line than the industry accepts or can speak with the class, but I wonder about your feelings about how much you want to add to something.
Yeah, I mean, the way I would answer that is that, and some of this will be obvious to you guys, but you're manipulating truth just by turning the camera on, you're already manipulating truth. You're choosing, you're selecting. And so the responsibility of the filmmaker and the editor is to figure out how to represent that in a way that feels honest. Adding things doesn't necessarily make it dishonest, but sometimes it does. And you're struggling with that question every moment throughout the film, and it's equally true to me in terms of juxtaposing two images as it is in terms of adding sound. One example from the opening shot of the film, not the opening shot, it's like 3 or 4 shots in, when you see the guys running, it's kind of a long shot, and they're running through the field and they're getting shot at. And in the sound mix, we had a sound editor on the film. I had no idea what she was doing. She was fantastic. But like, she would pull in whatever sounds were available to her, mostly from within the footage, but not necessarily from that moment. And we're sitting through the sound mix, and Sebastian says, that gunshot is the wrong gunshot. And she said, what do you mean? And he said, well, that's the sound of shots being fired from us at them. But we don't see anybody firing from us to them. We only see them getting fired at. We need to be hearing that. That sounds like popcorn. Not like the sound that you would normally expect from a gunshot. And so she went and fixed it, but he knew. I would not have known. And so bringing that sense of like, okay, how can we tell a story in a way that's honest is the number one question. And in some films what we're doing with music is doing that all the time. And so it's just a question of like, how can we signal to the audience when we're doing this? And when do we need to signal to the audience that we're doing this, as opposed to like, we're within a safe zone here, that people understand what happened and they understand that we've got some creative license to make this impactful and effective.
In your role as an editor, I guess, how does your aesthetic or the way that you're putting together a story depend on whom you're working with? Like, I think with Sebastian Gifford, between this film and Restored, I was having like a really specific aesthetic in filmmaking. And does that change for you when you're working with different people?
It definitely does. I'm a vessel as much as I'm a creator. And I like to say that in style, as well as in terms of individual edits and moments, I have the right of first suggestion. Meaning I get to do whatever I want because they're not sitting next to me the whole time. And they have the right to reject it, but they also have the right to accept it. And so, that gives me a lot of influence in terms of pushing the conversation. But they push the conversation back. And the filmmakers I'm working with now are very into lingering on emotional moments. And so I need to absorb that and hear that and make sure that I'm looking for that, because I know that if I don't find it, they're going to say to me, wasn't there a moment in Ray's interview where he broke down or where he just looked off to the side? And so, I absorb that in my canon of like, I need to be going through these stages to look for certain types of content. Sebastian, for instance, was very, very insistent that you could not hear a voice for more than 5 seconds before you saw the face that it was coming from. Oddly, except for his. We never see his face in the film. He did not want his face on film. And so I had to absorb that, and that was limiting in the edit, right? Like, I often want to be able to shorten stuff, and we'll use whatever coverage I'm coming off of to pack in 12 seconds of dialogue before I cut to them, because then we're going to sit on them and I'm going to have to live with the hems and haws and ums and ahs that I'm stuck with. And so, okay, that's what it is. Then I got to figure out how to deal with that and adapt to that.
I was wondering, what is the path to becoming a documentary film editor? This is something that the student here aspires to do. What kind of things should they be focusing on now to lay that groundwork?
I have no idea. I'll tell you my path. I studied films in undergrad, and I got lucky in that my senior project was a good story. I mean, it was pure luck. I went for 5 days with my dad, who's a rabbi and does social justice work. I went with him to Ethiopia on this project, and in addition to like the not ho-hum, it was actually interesting, but the kind of boring meetings that he was having, which is half of the film, there was a little boy who was getting adopted by a woman, an American, in the group with us. And so all of a sudden you have a much more dynamic film, and I was able to make an hour-long film, and it was through the process of making an hour film that I learned how to edit. There was almost no direct instruction on how to edit in my undergrad program. And despite having Penny Baker and Hedges as my thesis advisors, I mean, their filmmaking style is very particular as well, and you don't see that much of their style these days, though I actually like it. They were not giving me that kind of feedback, and so really just on the job doing it a lot. And I got lucky in my third or fourth film. There was a much more experienced editor working on it also, and I got to sit alongside her, and that was really helpful, both in terms of seeing just like how she used the keyboard, different ways in thinking about how to be fast and how to think while editing, in addition to sitting with her for an hour and not saying anything while she looked at note cards, which was very intimidating, but helpful to see how she would work through that stuff. I imagine there are more structured ways to get to this point.